A white passenger threatened a black baby with a razor. What the father did next turned the entire flight upside down. He thought fear made him powerful as the razor touched a baby's skin. He never imagined that same blade would taste his own blood next. Subscribe if you believe no act of cruelty goes unpunished. A sharp, sudden cry from the terminal's far side pierced the usual hum of airport noise. Heads turned briefly, but most travelers quickly resumed their routines, checking flight boards, clutching coffee cups, and dragging wheeled suitcases across the polished marble. Near Gate 47 of Cresline International Airport, Marcus Donnell stood still, eyes locked with the man across from him. The man's stare had weight. Not just curiosity or annoyance, but something colder, sharper. Henry Calden. Pale-faced, suited in tailored gray, posture ramrod straight like a statue carved from resentment. His gaze cut through the soft chatter and fluorescent calm with the quiet intensity of judgment. He didn't blink as he studied Marcus, not the average passing glance most gave a fellow traveler, but a prolonged look, dissecting, dismissing. Marcus said nothing. Caden, his 6-month-old son, squirmed softly in the light blue wrap strapped against his chest. One of the baby's tiny fists curled loosely near Marcus's collar, the other tucked securely between their bodies. The infant cooed again, oblivious to the tension unraveling just a few feet away. Marcus gently rocked his shoulder, shifting his weight to soothe the boy, his hand moving instinctively to cradle the child's small head. From the corner of his eye, Marcus could still feel the stare. Cold, unblinking. He turned slightly, angling himself away, but it lingered like smoke. The terminal's natural light beamed through towering glass panels, illuminating both men in soft golden hues, yet there was nothing warm about the silence between them. "Problem?" Marcus asked, his voice low, measured. Henry didn't answer. Instead, he raised his chin slightly as if Marcus's question was beneath response. Then, with a faint shake of his head and a subtle scoff, he looked away toward the gate agent now calling for pre-boarding. Marcus exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing just slightly. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered that look, disapproval wrapped in civility, superiority draped in silence. But something about this man was different, not just entitled, tense, controlled, but only barely. He checked his phone. 8:42 a.m., still 20 minutes before his boarding group. Caden stirred again, his small mouth making a wet, smacking sound before letting out a quiet sigh. Marcus smiled faintly, brushing a hand across the baby's soft curls. He could still smell the lavender from the lotion he'd rubbed on the boy's arms that morning in the hotel bathroom. The routine had become grounding. Feed, change, soothe, double-check documentation, rehearse conference slides, pack smart, stay ahead. Everything in his world now revolved around preparation, stability, safety. He scanned the crowd instinctively. Old habits from years of working in international spaces where being both a black man and a father sometimes attracted suspicion more than admiration. A businessman in a tan trench coat read a paper. A student leaned against a column, gaming. A flight attendant chatted with a gate agent. Then Henry again, standing too still, eyes flicking toward Caden with something unreadable behind them. Marcus shifted his posture to face a different direction, creating a barrier with his shoulder. He whispered softly to Caden, "Just a few more hours, little man. Then we're home." The baby blinked up at him, yawned, and nestled closer to his chest. It was enough to steady Marcus's thoughts. But just as the boarding call echoed again through the terminal speakers, "Now, boarding Group 2 for Cresline Airways, Flight 228 to Grayford City." Henry made his move. He stepped forward, not toward the gate, but diagonally, closer to Marcus, just close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. Then, casually, deliberately, he leaned toward Marcus and spoke under his breath. "You people always find a way to slow everything down." Marcus froze, lips parting slightly in disbelief. His heart kicked once in his chest before cooling into a slow burn. He turned his head sharply, meeting Henry's eyes full on. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice quiet but laced with steel. Henry gave a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't touch his eyes. "Don't pretend you didn't hear it." Then he pivoted smoothly and joined the boarding line, leaving Marcus standing still, pulse rising. The agent at the gate smiled, oblivious. "Boarding Group 3 now." Marcus adjusted cadence slightly, careful not to let his frustration travel into his movements. He glanced around. No one had heard. No one had seen. It had been precise, targeted, just like so many encounters before, too quiet for witnesses, too sharp to ignore. But this time, something inside Marcus shifted. By the time he reached his seat, 2 rows behind Henry's, he was calm again. Or so it appeared. The inside of his mind ticked forward, assessing, calculating, protecting. The plane's engines rumbled to life as passengers settled in. Caden had drifted back to sleep, the hum of the cabin like a lullaby. Marcus adjusted his seatbelt and looked out the window as clouds began to roll past, veiling the city below in soft white. And yet, he could feel it again. That same stare, over his shoulder, just for a second. Henry's head turned slightly. He didn't smile this time. Marcus didn't blink. He didn't know that a quiet flight would soon become a battlefield of restraint and fury. The moment Caden let out a soft whimper, Henry Calden's head snapped back as if a siren had gone off in his ear. His movements were too sharp for someone merely startled. They were rehearsed, too quick, too precise. He twisted in his seat, his pale neck turning stiffly like a hinge, and his eyes landed squarely on Marcus with an expression that teetered between disapproval and disgust. "Can you control that noise?" Henry muttered without turning fully, his voice low but razor-edged. Marcus looked up, blinking slowly as the words landed. His left hand rested protectively across his son's back, the tiny rise and fall of Caden's chest steady against his own. The remark stung, not because of its content. He'd heard far worse as a father and as a black man, but because of the chill behind it. It wasn't frustration. It was contempt. "I'm doing my best." "He'll settle down," Marcus replied quietly, his voice even and calm, offering nothing to escalate the tension. Henry didn't respond. Instead, he faced forward again, but not before letting out a sharp exhale through his nose, as if expelling the very presence of Marcus and his son from his space. His shoulders rose slightly, then fell, but never softened. The tension in his posture lingered like static in the air. The cabin lights dimmed gently, preparing the passengers for takeoff. Outside the window, a band of sunlight slipped behind a curtain of clouds, tinting the inside of the plane in tones of dull gold and gray. The engines hummed louder, vibrating through the floor beneath Marcus's feet. A flight attendant walked past, checking overhead bins with a practiced smile, oblivious to the invisible fault line running between rows 18 and 20. Marcus shifted slightly, adjusting Caden's position. The baby stirred again, making a tiny squeak of protest before settling back against his father's chest. Marcus leaned his head back and closed his eyes, trying to push aside the interaction. He had more important things to think about: his presentation, the schedule, ensuring Caden stayed fed and calm for the long flight ahead. But even with his eyes closed, he could still feel Henry's eyes, the weight of them, the pressure of unspoken judgment. He wasn't imagining it. He never imagined it. Across the aisle, a teenage boy popped in his earbuds and slouched into his seat, bobbing his head to music only he could hear. Further up, a businessman rustled through a folder of printed spreadsheets, the corners brushing loudly against the seat in front of him. Life moved on. Yet here, just 2 rows apart, a silent standoff simmered under the surface. 30 minutes into the flight, the plane began to level out above the clouds. The crew walked through with drink carts, offering soda and water. Marcus declined with a polite shake of his head, one hand always on Caden's back. The baby was still asleep, but his breathing had quickened slightly, sensitive to every vibration, every change in his father's mood. Henry turned around again, this time slower. There was no expression on his face, just a measured stillness that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Some people have no respect for others' peace," Henry said louder this time, not looking directly at him but letting the words fall like stones between them. Marcus opened his mouth, then shut it again. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew exactly what would happen if he said it. He took a deep breath and turned slightly toward the window, letting the coolness of the glass ground him. Caden shifted again, releasing another quiet cry. Barely more than a breath, but Henry flinched as if struck. Marcus glanced at the aisle, searching for a crew member. The nearest attendant was handing pretzels to a man 5 rows up. No one else seemed to notice. The world went on pretending everything was normal. And yet, it wasn't. Marcus had the growing sense of something out of place. Not just irritation, not just an impatient traveler, but something brewing behind Henry's eyes. Something not rooted in this flight or this moment. There was a shadow of deeper resentment, something long settled that had now found a target. From his seat, Henry pulled his tray table down unnecessarily hard and began to scribble something on the back of a napkin with a fountain pen. The sound of pen scratching against paper was deliberate, anxious. Marcus noticed the faint tremble in the man's hand. It wasn't fear, it was fury barely disguised. The baby's soft sigh broke the silence again. Henry's shoulders twitched. Marcus leaned in and pressed his lips gently to Caden's forehead. The warmth of his child was a steadying force, a reminder of his purpose. He wasn't here to fight a stranger's hate. He was here to protect this small, innocent life curled against his heart. Still, he could feel the walls closing. Every time Henry turned, it carved deeper into the fragile piece Marcus tried to hold. He considered calling a flight attendant, reporting the strange glances, the comments, the way Henry kept turning. But what would he say? That a man didn't like his baby breathing? That he spoke too sharply? The world didn't always hear those things as threats until it was too late. So Marcus waited, alert, listening, calculating. Outside the window, the clouds stretched like fields of smoke beneath the wings. The light dimmed further as the plane moved through time zones. Shadows crawled across the cabin. Some passengers had closed their eyes. Others watched in-flight movies with headphones in place. But in seat 20B, a man held his son like a shield, while 2 rows ahead, something venomous coiled tighter with every breath. Marcus didn't know when it would break, only that it would. He closed his eyes briefly, pretending to rest. But inside, his thoughts ran like current under ice. He thought about the edge of the tray table, the metal in the seatbelt buckle, the positioning of the call button above him. Every detail became a part of his quiet preparation. Not because he wanted violence, but because he knew, instinctively, that violence had already chosen him. Behind closed eyes, he whispered a silent promise to his son. "I won't let anything happen to you. Not while I can still breathe." The flight dipped slightly, and the soft ping of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin. Somewhere behind him, a passenger coughed. Somewhere ahead, Henry turned once more. Marcus opened his eyes and waited. The sky held its calm, but below it, something venomous was about to awaken. A sharp cry broke through the soft hum of the aircraft. It wasn't loud, just a sudden, startled wail from Caden as the bottle slipped from his small hands and fell against Marcus's chest. Marcus quickly reached down, adjusting the bottle and cradling his son closer. "Shh, it's all right, buddy," he whispered gently, rocking him ever so slightly, trying to calm him before the cabin stirred too much. But someone had already stirred. From 2 rows ahead, Henry Calden's shoulders jerked stiffly, his neck snapping toward the sound. His head turned just enough for one eye to meet Marcus's with unmistakable irritation. No, deeper than that. Disgust. Henry rose abruptly, knocking his knees into the seat in front of him. His movements were clipped and aggressive, like a man teetering on the edge of control. He muttered something low and sharp, inaudible but laced with venom, as he stepped into the aisle. Marcus's heart quickened. He watched Henry approach through narrowed eyes, expecting him to head toward the restroom. But Henry didn't pass. He stopped, right beside Marcus's row. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting long shadows along the aisle. Most passengers had their eyes closed or headphones on. It felt like the flight existed in two worlds now, one asleep and the other wide awake and filled with danger. Henry leaned down slowly. His face, pale and tight, hovered too close. Marcus could see the faint lines of tension around the man's mouth, the bloodless press of his lips. "You people always bring noise wherever you go," Henry whispered. The words were barely audible, but they struck with the force of a slap. Marcus blinked, caught off guard not just by the insult but by the intimacy of it. There was no mistaking the malice in the man's voice, cold, rehearsed, hateful. Marcus tightened his hold on Caden, who whimpered softly in his sleep. He didn't answer. Silence, he thought, was better than conflict in tight spaces. Better to stay calm. De-escalate. Don't let the moment explode. But Henry wasn't finished. From the inner lining of his gray coat, something metallic emerged. Marcus's breath caught as he saw it, slender, glinting, unmistakable. A razor blade, old-fashioned, the kind with a silver handle and a single sharp edge. Clean, deliberate, not something accidentally brought aboard. Marcus's eyes locked on it. His entire body tensed. Time seemed to slow. Henry's hand didn't waver. He crouched lower, just enough to avoid the notice of others, and pressed the blade against the side of Caden's tiny neck. The contact was barely a graze, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. "Make him stop," Henry hissed, "or I will." Marcus couldn't move. Not yet. Every part of him screamed to act, to snatch the weapon, to shield his son, to fight, but the fear of that blade pressing deeper froze his limbs. The cold steel against warm skin was a threat beyond comprehension. His vision tunneled. The lights overhead flickered faintly, reflecting in the razor's edge. Every noise in the cabin, the clicks of seatbelt buckles, the distant beep from a service panel, the rhythmic breathing of passengers vanished beneath the single sound of his heartbeat thundering in his ears. No one else noticed. Not yet. Marcus's mind raced. He knew this man. Not personally, but in essence. He'd seen men like Henry before, men who wore tailored suits and carved their hatred into every glance, every breath, every smug expression of superiority. Men who believed their silence gave them innocence. And now, one of them held a blade to his child's throat. Marcus's fingers twitched around the bottle in his hand. He shifted slightly, enough to tighten Caden against him and angle his own body between the child and the weapon. The movement was slow, calculated, driven by both instinct and discipline. He had to buy time. He had to read Henry's eyes. There was no panic in those eyes, just control. And that, Marcus realized, was worse than rage. This wasn't a man who'd snapped in a moment. This was a man who had prepared. Marcus's voice came out calm. "He's sleeping now." "There's no need for this." Henry didn't answer. His gaze flicked down to Caden, then back up with a sneer. The blade pressed a fraction closer. Marcus couldn't afford another second. He knew the moment was about to break. A flight attendant's footsteps echoed from the galley. Henry didn't hear them. Marcus did. In that sliver of opportunity, something shifted inside him. Not fear, not anger, but clarity. He saw the danger, measured it, and knew exactly what needed to be done. No room for mistakes, no chance for hesitation, not when a child's life balanced on a trembling edge. In that fragile heartbeat, a father's restraint hung by a single trembling edge. The blade touched Caden's neck. That was all it took. Marcus moved before thought could form, his instincts firing faster than reason. His right hand shot up like a coiled spring, clamping down on Henry's wrist with a strength that startled even himself. The cold glint of steel wavered for a split second as Henry's grip faltered under the sudden force. The blade trembled, then slipped, grazing Caden's delicate skin just below the ear. A thin red line appeared, shallow but horrifying. The baby's scream split the cabin, high-pitched and panicked, tearing through the quiet like a fire alarm. Gasps erupted from several seats. A man across the aisle jerked upright. A flight attendant dropped a drink tray somewhere in the rear. Still, time felt frozen, compressed into that single, paralyzed heartbeat. "Sit down." Marcus's voice cracked through the moment like thunder, deep and commanding. It wasn't a request. It was a command with teeth, forged in fear and fury. The passengers obeyed, not from understanding, but from sheer intimidation. Some sat down slowly, others sank without realizing it. A few stared, wide-eyed, unsure of what they had just seen or what might happen next. Henry twisted violently, trying to free himself. His face, once smug and composed, had contorted into a mask of panic and disbelief. But Marcus didn't waver. Years of quiet discipline, of lessons drilled into him by a father who believed a man must be ready to protect what matters most, took over. His movements became mechanical, deliberate. He gripped Henry's wrist tighter, twisting it downward with calculated pressure. Bones shifted beneath the skin. The razor blade, still wet with Caden's blood, flipped in Henry's fingers. Marcus seized it. For one breathless second, time slowed again. He could hear Caden crying. He could feel the heat of blood against his arm, warm and fresh. He could sense every eye on him, some fearful, some stunned, some frozen in indecision. But all he saw was Henry's face, that sneer, that contempt, that hatred. In one fluid motion, Marcus reversed the blade and dragged it across Henry's cheek. The cut was clean but deep, tracing a sharp diagonal just below the eye. Blood burst from the wound, bright against the pale skin, splattering the seat back, the floor, and Marcus's own hand. Henry screamed, reeling back, one hand flying to his face. He stumbled, tripped into his seat, and clutched the gushing wound, his voice shrill and broken. A second scream followed, this one from the baby. Caden's cries were now frantic, full of pain and confusion, his tiny body shaking against Marcus's chest. The cabin erupted. Flight attendants rushed forward, shouting overlapping orders. One of them, tall, young, and rattled, reached out to grab Marcus's arm but hesitated as he saw the razor still in Marcus's grip. Another passenger began to film on his phone, while a man in the row behind Henry ducked low, shielding himself from the chaos. Henry slumped in his seat, panting heavily, blood trickling through his fingers. He tried to speak, but his words were slurred, lost between pain and rage. He attacked me," Henry gasped. "He went crazy." But even in his state, the lie lacked power. The truth had already bled into the open air. Marcus didn't speak. He stood still, his chest rising and falling, one arm shielding Caden while the other gripped the razor with trembling control. His knuckles were white, his jaw locked, and in that moment no one could quite tell who was more terrifying, the bleeding man or the one holding the blade. The senior attendant, a middle-aged man with dark brows and a crisp uniform, stepped in. His voice cracked slightly as he tried to take command. "Sir, drop the weapon. Please, just place it on the seat. We'll handle this." Marcus turned his eyes toward him, expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he lowered the razor, placing it on the folded tray in front of him with precise care. His breathing was steady, but every muscle in his body was taut like drawn wire. He held Caden close, pressing his forehead gently to the baby's, whispering soft words of comfort. The crying didn't stop, but it softened, enough for Marcus to feel his own heartbeat begin to ease, though his mind remained in full alert. From behind, someone whispered, "What happened?" Another voice responded, "The man with the baby, he saved him." That other guy had a blade. There were no announcements, no music, no flight attendants wheeling carts down the aisle. Just the low hum of the engines, the soft cries of a child, and the heavy breathing of a man who had just fought to protect his son. No one else dared speak. Henry leaned back, shaking, the side of his face soaked in blood. His lips moved, but no words came. He looked smaller now, diminished, not just by injury, but by exposure. There was no longer anywhere for him to hide. Marcus didn't move again. He didn't need to. The message was already written, in red. And as the stunned cabin sat in a suspended silence, unable to process the full gravity of what had unfolded, a single thought settled over them like a cold wind. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of fear bowing to justice. Blood trickled down Henry's cheek in thick, gleaming rivulets, staining the crisp white of his collar as he slumped backward into his seat. The sharp, metallic scent of it mingled with the sterile cabin air. Passengers gasped. The scream still echoed faintly in the silence that followed, but it was the image, the razor, the child, the blood, that rooted everyone in stunned disbelief. "Don't touch me," Marcus said sharply, eyes still locked on Henry. His voice was steady, but a quiet fire simmered beneath each word. Flight attendant Evan Reeves had rushed in the moment chaos erupted. He'd grabbed Marcus's arm instinctively, drawn by reflex more than reason. But the moment he saw Caden's trembling body curled tightly against his father's chest, the pale scratch across the child's neck, and the glint of the weapon in Marcus's grip, he froze. His grip loosened. Marcus didn't move. His hand clenched the razor with purpose, not wild, not vengeful, but protective. The blade still held a faint smear of blood along its edge. Caden whimpered again, high and faint, and the sound pierced through Marcus like a needle. "He attacked my child," Marcus repeated, this time quieter but firmer. His eyes burned with a calm that chilled Evan to his core. There was no hysteria, no panic, just a father standing between his son and the man who had crossed a sacred line. Henry shifted slightly in his seat, one hand pressed clumsily to his cheek, the other grasping for the armrest. His words came out slurred, disjointed. "Discipline. Someone has to teach. People knowing their place." His voice cracked and his gaze darted around the cabin as if pleading for someone to understand. But no one came to his defense. Not a single passenger. The cabin buzzed with alarm. The captain's voice broke through the intercom, unnaturally calm, almost clinical. "Attention, crew. Please maintain order. Ground security has been notified and will meet us upon arrival. Remain seated until further instruction." Marcus didn't blink. He shifted Caden higher against his chest, cradling the child's head gently as he adjusted his own posture to block Henry's line of sight. His body was a shield. His mind, a battlefield of clashing instincts, rage and control, pain and precision. He knew the rules of survival. This wasn't just about defending his child, it was about making sure the truth wouldn't be twisted. Around him, the flight attendants moved quickly, clearing the area. Passengers were asked to shift to empty rows, some whispering anxiously as they obeyed. A few recorded the aftermath on their phones, trying to be discreet but unable to resist. One older man near the emergency exit looked at Marcus, then at Henry, then slowly stood and said to no one in particular, "I saw it. I saw what he did." Evan approached again, more cautious now. "Sir, please, can I take the blade?" Marcus's jaw tensed. "No," he said firmly. "Not until security arrives." "He might have more." His eyes flicked briefly toward Henry's jacket pocket, the one from which the blade had emerged. "You didn't search him. You don't know what he's capable of." Evan hesitated, then nodded slowly and backed off. There was no protocol for this. No training for a father holding a razor, protecting his baby from a man bleeding into his lap. Every second stretched thin, brittle, ready to snap. Caden stirred again, his face pressing against Marcus's chest, seeking comfort in the rhythm of his heartbeat. Marcus held him tighter, the muscles in his arms trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of restraint. His heart still raced with the aftershock of what had nearly happened. If he had been even 1 second slower, he didn't want to finish the thought. Reaching into his side pocket with one hand, Marcus pulled out his phone and quietly tapped the record button. He turned the camera on the scene. Henry's face, his bloody cheek, the seat numbers, the reactions of nearby passengers, and the flight crew standing in awkward silence. Evidence. Truth. Proof that would matter when the narrative shifted later. He zoomed in on Henry's hands. They were trembling now, not from pain, but from exposure. The man had revealed himself fully, and there was no way to stuff that ugliness back into polite silence. A few rows back, a man named Trent Mallory sat still, his gaze sharp, his body unnaturally calm. Dressed like any other businessman, his eyes missed nothing. He had clocked Henry before the flight even began. Something about the posture, the way the man stared, too intense, too calculated. Trent didn't stand. Not yet, but his hand slid toward the badge hidden beneath his coat, fingers brushing the edge of the holster strapped to his hip. He was an air marshal, off-duty but always alert, and now, finally, justified in his suspicions. Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin. The adrenaline hadn't left his system, but something had changed. The fire in his chest, once a raging storm, had cooled into something even more dangerous. Clarity. He knew now that this moment wouldn't end once the plane landed. There would be questions, headlines, allegations. He had to be ready. He angled the phone again, this time toward the bloodied fabric on Henry's collar. He documented every detail with a deliberate calm. The passengers were witnesses, yes, but recordings would survive memories. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure no lie buried the truth of what happened here. Trent finally stood, stretching slightly, pretending to adjust his jacket. But his eyes never left Henry. He didn't reveal himself yet. There would be time for that. Henry groaned lowly, head sagging forward, one eye squinting through the blood. "You'll regret this," he murmured, barely audible. "They always regret it." Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. The low drone of the engines filled the silence again as if the plane itself had exhaled. The sky outside remained a perfect blue, untouched by the cruelty within. And yet, something had shifted. The blade had drawn its first cut. But the wounds that truly mattered, the ones deeper than skin, still hid beneath layers of history, policy, and silence. Justice had drawn its first cut, but the deeper wounds were still hidden beneath the calm. The plane jolted slightly as it began its final descent into Grayford City. The seatbelt sign glowed overhead, casting a sterile blue light across the cabin. Marcus Donnell sat still, eyes fixed on the window but not really seeing anything beyond the scratched plexiglass. Caden lay against his chest, bundled in the soft blue wrap, his tiny body rising and falling with uneasy sleep. Marcus could feel the child's breath, warm and erratic, and beneath it, his own heartbeat pounding with restrained fury. 2 rows ahead, Henry Calden sat slumped in his seat, wrists bound in bright yellow zip ties, a blood-soaked cloth pressed to his cheek. The deep cut Marcus had given him, swift, deliberate, and unavoidable, was still oozing through makeshift gauze. Henry's lips moved constantly, his voice a low, incoherent mutter filled with curses, threats, and fractured grievances. Words like discipline, respect, and order hissed through his teeth, but none of it made any real sense. He seemed lost in his own storm of anger and humiliation, rocking slightly as though trying to shake off the reality of his failure. The flight attendants busied themselves with landing protocols, avoiding Marcus's gaze. Their movements were rushed, robotic, folding tray tables, checking latches, but none approached him. The air had grown heavy, electric with tension. Some passengers leaned into the aisle trying to glimpse the aftermath of what had unfolded mid-air. Whispers moved like waves. "He had a blade." "The baby's all right, thank God." "Did you see the blood?" A few gave Marcus quiet, almost apologetic nods. Others avoided looking at him altogether. The plane touched down with a low rumble, tires screeching lightly against the tarmac. As it slowed to taxi, Marcus adjusted Caden's wrap and kissed his forehead gently. The child stirred but did not wake. Relief touched Marcus's face for just a moment, until flashing lights appeared outside the windows. A convoy of law enforcement vehicles and medical vans stood waiting beside the jet bridge. Officers in dark uniforms moved into position, their radios crackling softly. Paramedics rolled stretchers and supply carts forward as soon as the cabin doors opened with a sharp hiss. The air inside the aircraft shifted again, now laced with anticipation and uncertainty. Marcus didn't move. He held Caden securely and waited, watching everything unfold with the wary focus of a man who knew how easily things could turn. A paramedic, mid-30s, with a neatly trimmed beard and serious eyes, approached him. "Sir," he said gently, "we need to take a look at the baby." Marcus gave a slow nod and carefully loosened the wrap so they could examine Caden's neck. The medic's gloved hands moved with practiced care. He whispered instructions to his partner, then looked up. "Surface cut only," he confirmed. "No deep trauma." "He'll be okay," Marcus exhaled quietly. "Thank you." But just as the medic stepped back, two uniformed officers moved in. One of them, older, with silver hair and sharp eyes, spoke with authority. "Sir, I need you to come with us." Marcus blinked, confused. "Why?" "We need to ask you some questions regarding the incident on board." "It's standard protocol," the officer said, his tone clipped but not aggressive. Behind them, Henry was being escorted out as well, muttering curses under his breath, face twisted in a sneer. Yet it was Marcus, the man who had defended his child, who was now being treated with suspicion. The injustice hit like a slap. "I'm the one who was attacked," Marcus said calmly, his voice edged with disbelief. "He put a blade to my baby's neck." "Sir, please," the younger officer said, stepping closer, hand drifting near his holster. "We just need your cooperation." And then, a quiet but firm voice cut through the tension. "That's not your suspect." All heads turned. From a few rows back, a man rose slowly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a federal badge now visible on his belt, Trent Mallory stepped into view. The calm in his voice carried the weight of someone used to command, used to being obeyed. "I'm Air Marshal Trent Mallory," he said clearly, eyes locking with the senior officers. "I witnessed the entire incident. Marcus Donnell acted in defense of his child. The man you want is Henry Calden." The room shifted. The officers exchanged glances. One opened a notepad. "You're confirming that the suspect, Henry Calden, initiated the assault?" "I am," Trent said without hesitation. He produced the weapon. He threatened an infant. Mr. Dannell responded proportionally, with minimal force. "I'll provide a full statement." There was a long pause as the officers recalibrated. The older one lowered his voice. "Understood. Mr. Dannell, you're free to go, for now, but we may still need to speak with you again." Marcus gave a small nod, clutching Caden just a bit tighter. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. As the officers moved away to question Henry, Marcus turned to Trent. "Why didn't you stop him earlier?" Trent's face was unreadable. "I was watching him the moment he boarded. Knew something was off, but I needed to be sure. Your reaction. It told me everything I needed to act." Marcus gave a tired, almost bitter smile. "You always wait until someone bleeds?" Trent didn't flinch. "Sometimes, yes. But I don't leave before I make sure the truth is seen." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Marcus adjusted the baby wrap again, tucking Caden's arm in as the child stirred. The corridor to the terminal stretched ahead. Fluorescent lights, cold tiles, more questions, more eyes. But for the first time since the flight began, Marcus didn't feel completely alone. Sometimes, he thought, watching the officers gather around Henry, the unexpected ally arrives only when the truth bleeds through the noise. The door to the terminal security office snapped shut behind Marcus with a mechanical clunk, sealing him into a room filled with sterile light and cold tension. Across the glass wall, Henry Calden sat with his arms crossed, a thick strip of gauze pressed against his cheek. The bandage, stained slightly with dried blood, glowed a dull red under the harsh fluorescent lights. His eyes locked onto Marcus's with a hatred so sharp it felt like it could pierce the glass between them. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared, like a wolf watching a gate it knew wouldn't hold. Two officers sat across from Marcus at the metal interview table. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled air, and the walls were lined with grainy security footage monitors looping various angles of the gate area. One officer, a younger man with a rigid jawline named Officer Brandt, adjusted his file folder with mechanical precision. The other, Sergeant Kellen, older and more weathered, leaned forward, hands folded under his chin. "Mr. Dannell," Kellen began, voice calm but edged. "We need to go over what happened on the flight, start to finish. Leave nothing out." Marcus nodded once. His voice remained steady. "I was seated in row 12B. My son was sleeping in a wrap across my chest. There was a man, Henry Calden, 2 rows ahead of us. He seemed irritated by the baby's sounds, even when they were barely above a whisper." Brandt scribbled something in his notes while Kellen watched Marcus's expression carefully. "At one point," Marcus continued, "he approached me. No warning. He leaned down and said something hateful, and then pulled a razor from his coat and pressed it to my son's neck." Brandt looked up sharply. "You're sure it was a razor?" Marcus reached into his jacket and slowly, deliberately placed his phone on the table. "This is the footage I recorded. There's also cabin footage from the crew's onboard system. You'll see it matches my story." Before the officers could respond, the door opened and Trent Mallory stepped in, his federal badge clipped visibly to his belt. His usual quiet demeanor carried an edge today. He didn't nod or smile. He simply walked forward and stood behind Marcus like a silent wall of truth. "I was on that flight," Trent said. "Saw the whole thing." Mr. Dannell did not provoke the attack. He acted only after the child's life was threatened. "I'm ready to give my formal statement." The room stilled. Brandt shifted in his seat. Sergeant Kellen leaned back and exchanged a glance with his partner, an unspoken confirmation that this was no ordinary case. Before anything further could be said, another man walked in briskly, briefcase in hand. He was clean-shaven, middle-aged, and wore a navy blazer bearing the airline's emblem. Behind him trailed a sharply dressed attorney with a silver tie and slicked-back hair. "I'm Mitchell Herron," the blazer-wearing man said, clearly agitated. "Crestlane Airways Internal Security Liaison. We need to ensure our protocols are respected during this process." Kellen raised an eyebrow. "We're conducting a police inquiry." "You're welcome to observe, but don't interrupt." The lawyer stepped forward. "I represent Mr. Calden. My client claims he intervened because he feared the child was in distress, possibly being mishandled. We believe this may have been a misunderstanding born of emotion rather than intent." Marcus's jaw tightened. He looked at the man, then at Trent, who stared straight ahead with a simmering calm. "That's a lie," Marcus said quietly. "He didn't show concern. He showed hatred, and he had a weapon. There was nothing emotional about it, it was planned." Brandt turned to Trent. "You confirm that?" "Yes," Trent replied. "He didn't act like someone worried about a baby. He acted like someone trying to dominate, intimidate. He used calculated words. He brought a concealed blade on board, which violates federal regulations. He targeted the child deliberately. There was a brief silence before the door opened one more time. A younger officer entered, holding a printed sheet. He walked quickly to Brant and handed it over. "You'll want to see this," he whispered. Brant's eyes scanned the document and his expression shifted. He handed it to Kellen, whose brow furrowed as he read. "What is it?" Marcus asked, watching the ripple of surprise moving through the room. Kellen looked up slowly. "Mr. Calden isn't just a passenger. He's a senior executive in Crestline's Internal Security Division. He was suspended 3 months ago for misconduct involving a passenger. But apparently he was still issued travel clearance under an alias Mitchell Heron's face drained of color." "That can't be correct," he said quickly. "That file should have been sealed." "Sealed?" Trent's voice turned sharp. "You knew about this?" The attorney stepped in, shielding his client's representative. "That's a matter of internal review." "No," Marcus interrupted, rising slightly in his seat. "It's a matter of accountability. You let a suspended executive board a flight, under a false name, with a weapon. And you're trying to paint me as the aggressor?" Sergeant Kellen stood now too, slowly placing the file on the table. "This changes the entire situation," he said. "If this man was traveling under false credentials, with an active suspension and prior incidents buried, then someone at your company will be answering for more than just an assault." Marcus sat back, the tension in his body coiling into something quieter but sharper. The battle ahead wasn't just legal, it was systemic. This was no isolated act of cruelty. It was something deeper, something hidden behind layers of protocol and privilege. He looked through the glass wall again, watching Henry's smug posture falter as officers now flanked him. Trent leaned down beside Marcus and whispered, "You just peeled back the first layer." Marcus gave the smallest nod, eyes narrowing with focus. He didn't need to say anything more. The truth was no longer his burden to prove. It was now the fire burning its way through every cold corner of that room. Beneath polite skies, darker orders were flying undetected. He pressed a razor against a helpless child's neck, grinning as the father watched in horror. If you believe evil deserves its reflection, hit subscribe now. Justice cuts sharper than hate ever could. The email arrived just past midnight. Marcus sat alone in the small apartment the airline had temporarily provided for him, the glow of the television casting muted colors on the walls. Caden was asleep in the next room, his breathing soft and steady through the baby monitor. Marcus stared at the subject line. Urgent. Settlement proposal from Crestline Airways Legal. Then clicked it open with a steady hand and a pounding heart. The message was short, clinical, and designed to appear generous. A 6-figure settlement, full coverage of medical costs, and an additional discretionary stipend if Marcus agreed to drop all public charges and sign a non-disclosure agreement. It was, in effect, a price tag on silence. Marcus read it twice, then leaned back, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. He knew what this was, a lifeline for the airline, not for him. They wanted to shut him down before the world could hear the full story. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Trent Mallory stepped in without waiting for a formal invite, holding a brown folder in one hand and a weathered expression on his face. "They're moving faster than I thought," Trent said, placing the folder on the table between them. "And it's not just about damage control anymore. They're preparing to discredit you if this goes public." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His fingers ran along the edge of the email printout he'd already made. "They want me to vanish," he said quietly. Trent nodded. "And they're counting on you needing peace more than justice." He opened the folder, revealing copies of past reports, incident summaries, internal emails, passenger complaints, all connected to Henry Calden, all ignored. Most were marked closed without action. One stood out, a handwritten statement from a passenger who described being threatened mid-flight by a man matching Henry's description. No audio, no video. Case dismissed, the summary read. "How long have they known?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "Years," Trent replied. "But Henry's father is a retired board consultant." They protected him, buried it all. The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside the window, rain began to tap against the glass in soft, rhythmic beats. Marcus stood slowly, walking to the window and watching a jet lift off into the fog. "They let him near my son, knowing what he was capable of." Trent spoke with quiet conviction. "This time's different. It was public, recorded. They can't bury this unless you let them." Marcus turned back. "And if I don't take the deal?" "They'll come for your name," Trent warned. "They'll say you overreacted, that you endangered the flight, that you assaulted an unarmed man. They'll dig into your past, your work, even your parenting. They'll do anything to paint you as unstable." Marcus didn't flinch. Let them try. Over the next few days, the media storm swelled. Passenger videos flooded social media, some blurry, others crystal clear. They showed Henry towering over Marcus, the glint of the razor, the blood, the stunned faces. News anchors replayed the footage on endless loops. Online commentators split into factions. Some hailed Marcus as a protector. Others, notably ones on anonymous forums and curated panels, claimed he had escalated a manageable situation with unnecessary violence. One network ran a segment with a behavioral analyst who, without ever speaking to Marcus, described him as a man under severe emotional stress, possibly paranoid, citing his firm grip on the child during turbulence as aggressive. Marcus watched it in silence. Caden sat on his lap, babbling softly, unaware of the storm his father was weathering. Then came the smear pieces. An old civil disagreement with a coworker from 5 years ago suddenly became headline fodder. A delayed code release at Marcus's firm was twisted into accusations of negligence. One op-ed even implied that Marcus, being a single father, might have brought an unstable domestic dynamic onto the flight. He slammed the laptop shut, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. That evening, Adrian Cole, his assigned legal representative, arrived with updates. Adrian was sharp, methodical, and completely unfazed by the media circus. He tossed a few printed articles onto the table. "They're trying to draw blood," Adrian said bluntly. "We'll give them ink instead." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means we go to inquiry. On record, on camera. We show everything. Their cover-ups, the internal silence, your recordings, the documents Trent provided. If they want a fight, we give them one in full daylight." Marcus took a breath, glancing at his son sleeping on the couch nearby, bundled in a pale blue blanket. "Let's do it." The next morning, as the inquiry board was formally assembled, Adrian filed a motion to subpoena Crestline's internal complaint logs. The airline's legal team protested, citing confidentiality, but the panel overruled. Trent, ever composed, submitted his report quietly. He'd also uncovered additional surveillance footage from airport terminals showing Henry's pattern of aggressive behavior even before the flight. Despite the mounting evidence, Marcus knew the hardest battle wasn't legal, it was perception. He had become a symbol, and symbols were easy to distort. One night he received an anonymous email. The subject line was blank. The body of the message was simple. "Drop it. For your child's safety, no sender, no trace. Just words, sharp and quiet, like the blade that had grazed his son's neck." He stared at it for a long time, then called Trent. "They've started the threats," Marcus said. His voice wasn't shaken, just colder now. Trent paused, then replied, "I'll notify the feds." "But Marcus, this means you've hit a nerve. They're scared." Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Good," He looked over at the framed photo on the shelf. Caden smiling at a park swing, his tiny hand reaching upward, the light catching his curls. Marcus ran a thumb over the image, grounding himself in that moment. He whispered to no one in particular. This isn't about fame. It's about making sure no one else has to live through this. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window slightly. Marcus didn't flinch. The noise no longer mattered. The silence was more dangerous now. He turned off the light and stood near Caden's crib, watching his son breathe, steady and untroubled. When truth threatens power, silence often comes with a price tag. The room was cold, sterile, and full of eyes. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly above as Marcus Donnell took his seat at the long rectangular table, his back straight but shoulders heavy with the weight of what this day could become. Across from him, behind a line of polished microphones and glass pitchers of untouched water, sat the panel, 4 corporate attorneys, 3 federal transportation investigators, and 1 representative from Kreslin Airways' Internal Ethics Division. To their left, seated stiffly and flanked by his own legal team, was Henry Calden. Henry's face was mostly hidden behind a thin layer of medical tape, a calculated touch meant to signal victimhood. The bruising around his eye had faded, but the bandage remained, stretching from cheekbone to jaw like a lie that refused to heal. He avoided looking at Marcus directly, instead whispering occasionally to his lawyer, his voice low and snake-like, threading through the stale air like poison. Marcus kept his gaze locked forward, fists gently clenched beneath the table, out of sight. Adrian Cole, his lawyer, leaned toward the microphone and began his opening. Our client's actions were the direct result of a violent threat to his infant son's life, he stated calmly, each word clipped and professional. The aggressor, Mr. Calden, initiated a physical assault using a concealed razor blade, an act witnessed and documented both by passengers and airline security. Before Adrian could continue, one of the airline's lawyers, a pale, bearded man named Grant Wilder, interjected. Mr. Dannell's response, while emotionally understandable, must be measured by legal standards. Excessive force, even in response to provocation, is still excessive. Adrian responded with a slight tilt of his head. Is slicing a child's neck with a blade considered mere provocation, counselor? A hush settled over the room. Marcus's heart pounded, not from fear, but from restraint. He glanced sideways at Henry, who suddenly leaned forward and murmured just loud enough to carry across the space between them. The look on that child's face. It was worth every second. The words hit Marcus like a slap. His spine stiffened, jaw tightening as his knuckles turned white. For a moment he could feel himself slipping, feel the courtroom fading as a darker place from the past tried to rise. But before he could move, Adrian's hand gently touched his forearm, a quiet but firm anchor. Don't give him what he wants, Adrian whispered. Not here. Not now, Marcus blinked, grounding himself, his focus sharpening again as the moment passed. Just then, the double doors at the back of the room opened with a low groan. Trent Mallory entered, dressed in a muted navy blazer, his badge clipped plainly to his hip. He carried a black folder, thick with documents. Without a word, he strode confidently to the witness table. I have supplemental evidence, Trent announced, voice calm but pointed. Classified logs, internal communications, and previous incident reports regarding Mr. Calden's behavior during and before his time at Kreslin Airways. The lead investigator, a silver-haired man named Carlton Reeve, frowned. You're saying this wasn't an isolated outburst? No, sir, Trent replied. This was a pattern. A dangerous one. And it was covered up. Gasps echoed through the room as Trent handed over the documents. Pages rustled. Email threads revealed complaints filed by flight attendants, notes from psychological evaluations red flagging Henry for anger issues, and most damning, an internal memo explicitly stating that Henry had been temporarily suspended due to racial sensitivity concerns, but reinstated quietly due to connections within security. Grant Wilder paled. One of the investigators shook his head slowly, while another scribbled furiously on his notepad. Henry's previously smug expression cracked. He whispered something urgently to his lawyer, who leaned away from him as if distance might spare him the fallout. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. The evidence was speaking louder than he ever could. Adrian leaned into the mic once more. Your Honors, this is not just about one flight, one man, or one moment. This is about systemic negligence and a deliberate choice to put passengers, including an infant, at risk. Henry slumped lower in his chair, the bandage on his face now less a symbol of innocence and more a brand of consequence. Carlton Reeve looked around the room, his voice stern. We will recess briefly to verify these documents, but let me be clear, this changes the nature of our inquiry. As the panel members stood and began to exit, Marcus remained seated. Across the table, Henry locked eyes with him for the first time. No smirk, no arrogance. Only fear. Real, heavy fear. Marcus didn't flinch. As Trent passed behind him, he leaned down and spoke quietly. You did good, Marcus. The truth's finally out. And as the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus sat in stillness, the echo of Trent's words wrapping around him like armor. The sharpest blade that day wasn't steel, it was truth cutting through deceit. The knock at Marcus's hotel room door came just after midnight. He had just put Caden to sleep, the soft rise and fall of his son's breathing the only thing grounding him after the exhausting day. With caution, Marcus approached the door and checked the peephole. No one. He opened it slowly, just a crack, enough to notice the envelope on the floor. There was no name, no stamp, just one word typed neatly on the front. Enough. His chest tightened. He picked it up carefully, closing the door and locking it behind him. The room was dim, the television playing low coverage of the unfolding Crestline scandal. As he sat on the edge of the bed, he peeled the envelope open, unfolding the single sheet inside. His eyes scanned the printed message. Let the matter go. For your child's safety. A long silence followed. Marcus stared at the words, unmoving. The room felt colder, smaller. Caden whimpered in his crib, and Marcus rushed over, placing a gentle hand on his son's back. He stayed there, crouched beside him, listening to the child's soft breathing until it steadied again. Then he rose slowly and picked up his phone. The first person he called was Trent. Someone left a threat at my door, Marcus said, voice low, steady. Trent's voice sharpened instantly on the other end. Describe it. Marcus explained everything, the wording, the lack of signature, the timing. Trent didn't hesitate. I'm coming over. Don't open that door again until I arrive. 20 minutes later, Trent Mallory stood in the hotel room, coat damp from the light rain outside, the letter in a sealed evidence bag. His demeanor was professional but colder than usual, his jaw clenched as he scanned the room's windows and locks. He placed a small recording device on the desk and started cataloging Marcus's account in full detail. They knew where you were staying, Trent muttered, and they waited until the media noise died down to strike. Marcus sat at the desk, hands folded tightly. They're not just trying to discredit me anymore. They want me scared. Trent nodded grimly. This isn't about courtroom wins anymore. It's about control. Someone with access, possibly internal, is trying to cover more than Henry's misconduct. The next morning, Adrian Cole arrived with his suitcase still in hand, sleeves rolled up and expression grim. Marcus had forwarded him a photo of the note just before dawn. Together, the three men sat in the hotel lounge, away from the press and the noise, reviewing every piece of documentation they had. Adrian placed a thick folder on the table. This isn't just one man's failure. It's institutional. Look at this, 8 misconduct reports buried in the last 3 years. Same pattern. Minority passengers, verbal or physical intimidation, all dismissed quietly. Marcus flipped through the pages, each one feeling heavier than the last. There were photos, statements, even internal emails with familiar names. Some of those names had signed Henry's reinstatement papers. They knew, Marcus whispered, and they let him fly anyway. Adrian tapped the table. I want to escalate. Federal case, full transparency motion. But if we do this, they won't just try to threaten you again. They'll go after your reputation, your job, your privacy, anything they can twist. Marcus looked out the hotel window, eyes lingering on the distant horizon. Then we make it public before they can distort it. Trent leaned forward. We'll need the press on our side. Whistleblower protection. Full cooperation from the Department of Aviation Oversight. But Marcus, once we start this, there's no going back. Marcus turned to look at Caden, asleep in his stroller nearby, completely unaware of the storm around him. Then his gaze hardened. Let them come. The next 48 hours moved fast. Adrian filed the motion with the federal court. Trent secured protective surveillance for Marcus and Caden. Meanwhile, a leak, intentional or not, sent the story spiraling into national headlines. News anchors dissected the footage frame by frame. Marcus shielding his child, the flash of the razor, Henry's bloodied face. Talk shows debated morality, restraint, justice. Hashtags spread across platforms. Hashtag Father in Flight. Hashtag Crestline Truth. Hashtag Justice at 30,000 feet. But with publicity came distortion. Some commentators accused Marcus of using his child as a prop to inflame public sympathy. Others insinuated he was exploiting the system for fame. A few dark corners of the internet began circulating false narratives, edited clips, and even doctored audio claiming Marcus had provoked the incident. He didn't sleep much. Adrian called late one night, sounding more tired than ever. They're trying to drown the truth in noise. But we've got one weapon they don't. What's that? Marcus asked, rubbing his eyes. Reality, Adrian said, and Trent just uncovered something. The next morning, Trent arrived with a USB drive and a sealed envelope. Surveillance logs, he said, sliding the drive across the table. Security footage from the flight deck. They prove Henry was flagged by another passenger before boarding, and the report was ignored. Marcus opened the envelope. Inside were printed emails. One thread included an executive saying, "We can't afford to sideline our own just because someone's uncomfortable. Handle it quietly." Marcus exhaled slowly. So, it was systemic. Trent nodded. And deliberate. Adrian looked up from the documents. This is what we needed. It proves this wasn't just negligence. It was protection, shielding someone dangerous because it was convenient. But just as hope began to swell, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message with no words, just a photo. Caden, outside their hotel earlier that day. The image had been taken from across the street, from behind glass. Marcus's hands shook. "They're watching us," he whispered. Trent jumped into action, immediately calling in a tactical unit to sweep the hotel perimeter. Adrian stood, knuckles white. "That's it," he snapped. "We go full throttle, no silence, no compromise." Marcus stared at the photo a moment longer before deleting it. "They want me to be afraid," he said softly. "But they made a mistake." Trent raised an eyebrow. "What mistake?" "They reminded me why I'm doing this." That evening, Marcus held Caden close, sitting near the window, watching the sun dip below the skyline. A press conference had been scheduled for the next day. The world would hear everything, unedited, unfiltered, no more secrets, no more hiding. Outside, traffic moved steadily, unaware of the storm brewing behind glass. Marcus whispered to his son, "I promise, no one will ever hurt you again." And with that, he stood up, taller than before, a man sharpened by fire but unbroken. Sometimes justice doesn't walk a straight path, it climbs through storms, holding a child close in one arm and courage in the other. The courtroom doors swung open with a heavy thud, the sound echoing through the tall ceilings like a warning bell. Reporters lined the marble steps outside, their lenses aimed and ready, but inside a hush had fallen, thick, expectant, reverent. Marcus Donnell stepped forward into the chamber, Caden not with him this time, but carried in his mind like armor. The walls were lined with federal officials, airline representatives, legal observers, and a public audience whose eyes darted between sympathy and scrutiny. Henry Calden was already seated, pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, his face partially concealed by a bandage that stretched down one side of his cheek. His suit was sharp, but his posture betrayed him, tense, coiled, as if he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. His legal team whispered among themselves, shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact with Marcus. Marcus took his seat beside his attorney, Adrian Cole, who gave him a quiet nod. Adrian had a binder in front of him, full of arguments, testimony, and evidence, but his real strength today was something else: conviction. Trent Mallory, the air marshal whose quiet authority had shifted the early narrative, was seated just behind them, his eyes calm but sharp. "Let's begin," the lead federal investigator said, tapping a gavel lightly against the desk. Testimonies began, each one a brushstroke in the broader portrait of negligence, cover-ups, and bias. A former airline compliance officer recounted how multiple complaints involving Henry had been flagged, but mysteriously disappeared from internal files. A security analyst brought forth redacted emails, digital footprints showing that Henry had been reinstated under orders from higher management despite a clear psychological risk assessment. As the documents were read aloud, Henry sat still, but his jaw clenched tighter with every revelation. Occasionally, his eyes flicked toward Marcus, full of a cold fury that no longer had ground to stand on. He whispered something to his lawyer, who scribbled furiously, but the defense's strategy was unraveling thread by thread. Then Adrian stood. "Your Honor," he began, voice even but charged with a quiet intensity, "what happened to my client wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't turbulence. It was the result of a calculated decision by this airline to prioritize internal loyalty over human safety, a decision that endangered an innocent child." A wave of murmurs rolled through the room. Adrian continued, "We're not just asking for accountability for a single man's actions. We're asking this court to recognize a systemic failure, to set a precedent that no parent, regardless of background, should have to endure what Mr. Donnell endured simply because their child cried on a plane." He paused, turned slightly to Marcus, and gave a subtle nod. Marcus rose slowly. His steps to the stand were steady, but each one carried the weight of months of sleepless nights, threats, and the haunting flash of a razor's edge. "I didn't come here to be a symbol," Marcus said, his voice low but clear. "I came here because my son's life was put at risk, and the people responsible tried to make me feel like I was the threat." He looked directly at the panel of judges and investigators. No parent should fear flying because of the color of their child's skin. The silence that followed was complete. No rustle of paper, no shifting of chairs, just stillness. Even the air felt heavier. The words had landed with a precision that no argument could counter. The judge didn't immediately speak. He let the moment breathe. Then Trent was called forward. He approached with calm authority and opened a sealed folder. "These are internal security reports filed against Mr. Calden over a 2-year period. Each one shows a pattern: racially charged comments, physical intimidation, reckless behavior. Every report was buried. I know because I filed 2 of them myself." His eyes met the judge's, "and I was told to drop them." There was no defense left. Henry shifted uncomfortably, the tension in his jaw finally breaking as he whispered frantically to his counsel. It didn't matter. The judge motioned for silence. "This court finds sufficient evidence of both individual and institutional misconduct," the lead investigator said. We are recommending immediate federal sanctions and a full criminal referral." Two bailiffs approached Henry's table. As they gestured for him to stand, Henry resisted briefly before rising with a face drained of its usual confidence. The scar on his cheek, now healing but visible, caught the overhead lights. Marcus watched quietly. Not with satisfaction, but with a deep, quiet ache. One part grief, one part justice. Adrian placed a steady hand on his client's shoulder. Outside the courthouse, the steps were once again packed with reporters, lights flashing like silent thunder. But Marcus kept his head low, not to hide, only to shield his thoughts from the noise. Trent joined him outside, standing just off to the side, arms folded. "You did more than just speak," Trent said. "You made them listen." Marcus nodded once, emotion flickering beneath his controlled expression. He felt the weight lift, if only slightly. He looked down the steps, past the press, to the street where the world moved on, unaware that something important had shifted inside that building. Caden would never know the full story. Not today, maybe not for years. But one day he would understand that his father didn't fight to be seen. He fought so his son would never be made to feel invisible. Marcus exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the courthouse doors behind him. "When justice lands," he murmured, "even the loudest engines fall silent." Marcus stood in the hallway of St. Rainer Psychiatric Facility, the polished linoleum floor beneath his feet gleaming under the weight of fluorescent light. The air was sharp with antiseptic, unnervingly sterile, like the institution had scrubbed not just germs but all traces of humanity from its walls. He held a visitor's badge clipped to his shirt, the ink still fresh, the edges stiff. A nurse with downcast eyes and a clipboard guided him toward a small room at the end of the east wing. Neither spoke. The quiet was too heavy to lift. Inside, the room was bare. White walls, one narrow window covered with wire mesh, a bed bolted to the floor. And there, sitting on the edge of it with shoulders hunched forward and hands limp in his lap, was Henry Calden. His gray suit was gone, replaced by standard-issue pale blue scrubs. He looked thinner, older. His once sharp face had softened with fatigue, but the scar on his cheek remained, a thin pink line. A whisper of the day, everything changed. Marcus stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. Henry didn't look up. "I'm not here to mock you," Marcus said quietly. "I came to understand." Henry slowly turned his head, his gaze sluggish, unfocused. There was no fire in his eyes now, just fog. "Understand what?" he asked, his voice hoarse like it hadn't been used in days. "Why someone like you, someone in a position of power, could become that hateful." Henry gave a bitter chuckle, barely audible. "Hate doesn't start big. It trickles in, like a leak in the ceiling. You don't fix it, it rots the whole house." He tilted his head slightly, studying Marcus like he was trying to remember something from a dream. "You think I was always like that?" "No," Marcus replied, "but you let it fester. And when someone gave you power, you used it to hurt the people you feared." Henry looked away, his fingers twitching. "The job made it easy. People like me got protected because we kept order. That's what they told us." He shook his head slowly. "It's strange. You spend your life trying to prove you're better than someone else. Then one day, you wake up in here and realize you were never anything to begin with." Silence sat between them like a wall. Marcus studied the man who once pressed a blade to his child's neck, not with hatred, but with a strange detachment, like observing the final pages of a book he no longer feared to finish. "I'm not forgiving you," Marcus said after a moment, "but I'm not carrying you with me anymore either." Henry didn't reply. He simply turned toward the window, eyes unfocused. Marcus stepped back toward the door. The handle felt cool against his palm. As he opened it, Henry spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I still see his face. The baby. Every night. I wasn't trying to kill him. I just wanted the world to stop moving without me." Marcus paused at the threshold, his jaw tight. "You lost your place in the world the moment you saw a child as an enemy." He left without another word. Outside the building, a cluster of reporters stood behind a rope line, their cameras ready, microphones raised like weapons of curiosity. The moment Marcus emerged, questions volleyed at him. "Mr. Dannell, is it true you visited Henry Calden today? Did he show remorse? Do you believe justice has been served?" Marcus held up a hand, stopping them with calm authority. His suit was simple, but his presence made the air around him shift. The microphones leaned in closer. "I'll say this once," he said, his voice carried unshaken. "We didn't win because we fought harder. We won because we refused to stay silent." The crowd stilled. No follow-up questions. Just the quiet click of cameras. That evening, as dusk painted soft colors across the sky, Marcus stood by Caden's crib. The child breathed evenly, fingers curled around a stuffed bear, unaware of the war his father had fought for his future. Marcus reached down, brushing his son's cheek gently with the back of his knuckle. Caden didn't stir. His peace was intact, and for the first time in many restless months, Marcus felt the tension in his chest loosen, not disappear, but loosen, like a knot starting to unravel. He stepped back, exhaled deeply, and turned off the light. Peace doesn't erase scars. It teaches you how to wear them. The wind swept gently across the rooftop observation deck of Cresline International, carrying with it the distant thunder of aircraft engines and the hum of progress. A glass-paneled barrier stretched along the edge, reflecting the early afternoon sun and offering a clear view of the runways below. On the far end of the deck, a crowd had gathered, executives in dark suits, government officials in tailored coats, airport staff in pressed uniforms, and members of the press with cameras perched on shoulders. But, standing apart from them all, dressed in a simple charcoal jacket and navy slacks, was Marcus Dannell. He wasn't there to make a speech or pose for headlines. He came for something quieter, something earned. Beside the main platform, flanked by 2 white banners emblazoned with the new program's logo, stood a large display board. At its center, a striking silhouette of a man holding a child, stylized, faceless, but unmistakably Marcus and Caden. Beneath the image, bold letters spelled the initiative's name, Flight Unity. It was meant to honor what had happened a year ago, but Marcus wasn't sure honor was the right word. No image, however symbolic, could carry the weight of a razor's whisper or the echo of a courtroom gone still. He stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the glass. Through the transparent barrier, he could see planes gliding across the tarmac, rising one after another into the crisp blue sky. In that moment, the distant roar felt different, not just the sound of engines, but of movement, of change lifting off. Behind him, steady footsteps approached. "Still don't like cameras, huh?" came a familiar voice. Marcus turned slightly, offering a small nod. Trent Mallory, now wearing a dark badge over his chest marked Federal Aviation Ethics Division, stood beside him. His posture was firm, but his face showed quiet ease. "They tried to get me to speak," Marcus said, eyes returning to the runway. "I told them the silhouette was enough." Trent smirked. "You know, sometimes the greatest revolutions begin in silence." Marcus allowed himself a brief laugh, short, hollow, but real. "Silence started this," he said. "It shouldn't have taken a scar to make people hear." A moment passed between them. The sky above was cloudless, open. A new plane roared past overhead. Trent glanced toward the main gathering, where photographers were snapping pictures of a framed certificate being held by a congressional aide. "They're giving you something," he said. "Recognition." "I didn't do it for that." "I know," Trent said, "but you still earned it." Footsteps approached again, heavier, deliberate. Adrian Cole joined them, adjusting his tie and holding a manila folder in one hand. His presence was always calm, always anchored in logic. But today, a rare trace of pride flickered in his expression. "I'm glad I found you both," Adrian said, handing Marcus the folder. "Congress just finalized it this morning. Official language. Your case has been entered into the record, landmark status." Marcus opened the folder slowly, scanning the embossed text and government seal. The words didn't feel real at first. They spoke of reform, of legal precedent, of protections for vulnerable passengers and mandatory background reviews for crew members with prior suspensions. It was all there, in writing. The system had bent, but it hadn't broken him. He closed the folder carefully. "I just wanted to fly in peace," he murmured. "That's all." "And now thousands more might," Adrian replied, his voice low, "because you didn't let them silence you." Marcus looked out again toward the planes, his thoughts quiet but restless. Below them, near the edge of the terminal, a small play area had been built adjacent to a glass wall. In it, Caden toddled back and forth, giggling, his arms outstretched like airplane wings. A small blue cap bounced on his head with each step. Marcus watched him silently. The boy was too young to remember the incident, too young to know that his laughter had once been met with a blade, and maybe that was a blessing. "He's growing fast," Trent noted. "Too fast," Marcus said with a faint smile, "but I'd rather chase him on solid ground than through turbulence." A plane lifted in the background, its wheels folding into the belly of the machine as it disappeared into the clouds. For a moment, all three men stood together. No titles, no trials, just survivors of a long, turbulent journey. "People ask me if I regret how it ended," Marcus said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I don't. Not the fight, not the hearings, not even the scar." Trent glanced at him. "You wear it well." "I wasn't talking about me," Marcus said, eyes fixed on the image of Henry Calden projected on the news screen across the deck. Faded now, archived beneath layers of stories. The man's cheek had healed, but the world had not forgotten. Adrian checked his watch. "They're about to unveil the interior exhibit. You want to say anything to the press?" Marcus shook his head. "Let the silhouette speak." It's quieter, stronger. He took one final look at Caden, who had now crouched beside a toy plane in the sandbox, his small fingers brushing its wings like they were sacred. A breeze rolled through the deck, carrying the scent of fuel and clouds. Marcus breathed in, not with fear, but with resolve. The past still echoed, but today was about flight. As the speakers called for the official dedication, Marcus stepped back from the glass and stood tall beside his allies. The crowd turned. The cameras flashed. But Marcus wasn't watching them. He was watching the sky. The scar on Henry's cheek had faded, but its story would never die. It lived in every new policy, every changed heart, every father holding his child closer before takeoff. From one blade of cruelty, 1,000 wings of justice took flight. He tried to draw blood from the innocent, and found his own pouring seconds later. If you believe justice must always strike back for the voiceless, subscribe now, because cruelty never walks away clean. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, fear, and the consequences of hatred when power is abused. Its purpose is to raise awareness, encourage empathy, and inspire conversations about justice and equality.